So without any further ado, I'm going to kick off with my presentation, which is going to deal with the assessment of community social pediatrics interventions. It will be divided into two main subjects. First of all, I'm going to talk about sources of complexity in assessing the CSP interventions. These are elements that have already been mentioned more or less directly and indirectly as well in the presentations this morning. So I'm going to talk to you about some of my observations and what I've learned with this world of the CSP over the last year. And then also I'm going to talk to you about certain research designs that can be useful to set up to look at the impact of all of this. And I'm not going to go into too many details. So we're going to try and stimulate your interest to learn more about this type of research design. So to kick off, I've already told you a bit about myself earlier, so now I'm going to put a question to you with the polls everywhere. So if you want, you can give an answer to this question. So this, I'm going to put a first question, then a second question to you, and then when I go back home, I'll be able to extract the answers to your questions on an anonymous basis, and I'll try and see if there's any trends emerging from this. I thought I would actually use this research occasion, because when you're a researcher, you're always a researcher. Apparently it's not working at the moment. So perhaps we need to come back for a minute. Benoit, can you... Oh, you can see it? All right, it's up there for you. Excellent. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to answer these questions, basically to see what is your current function or position. We can see that we've got lots of family physicians and pediatricians, social workers, educators, psychoeducators, and then other. That was the category where I thought, well, I hope that it won't go right down there. I didn't know what to put under other. I'd really like to know who you are in this other category. Yes, I put other professionals, didn't I? Working in the CSP centres. So now you'll understand perhaps why I'm putting this question, because here's my second question, work lab. So I'd like you to tell us here whether... I hope this is working. I think I'm going to have to get a helping hand from Benoit again. Here we are. Luckily, he's here with us. So please name one element in the life of the children who are followed in the CSPCs, which has been affected by the intervention. Something that's important. It can be an element linked to the child or their environment. What has changed thanks to the social pediatrics intervention? I'll leave you a couple of minutes to answer. We've got self-esteem, creating networks, question of anxiety. Yes, there's a great deal of people talking about self-esteem, security, development, confidence or trust. And then there's the relationship between parents and children, their behavior, attachment, resilience, confidence or trust, hope. We've got a whole mix-up here. So that shows what's going to come up in the next point, in fact. Let's come back to this slide. This is one of the sources of complexity when assessing this type of intervention, because there are many impact indicators and they touch on various spheres in the life of the child. We've seen that with all of your answers. When I started to read about social pediatrics and I went to clinics and had discussions with different players involved in that world, I started taking notes every time an indicator was directly named or indirectly mentioned, or when an idea came up for a new indicator that could perhaps show the influence of social pediatrics. I noted it down, and that led me to this table. Now, I understand that you're not able to read everything that's listed up here. Some of them are more relevant or less relevant than others, but these are all elements where I established a link with what's being done in the world of social pediatrics. There are lots of different dimensions in terms of health, about 10, the psycho-emotional side, the behavioral, schooling, social, developmental, toxic stress. One of the objectives of social pediatrics is to reduce the sources of toxic stress and or minimize their impact on children. And then there's more global indicators of well-being, quality of life, happiness, their overall functioning. Then there's the family-related indicators, and then in their own neighborhood with the different measures and the social pediatric interventions. When we build on these over time, perhaps we can see changes in the more global indicators related to the neighborhood. So that's the first aspect in terms of the complexity of assessing this type of social pediatric intervention. And then we've got short, medium and long-term intervention targets in the short term. For example, we can be setting up interventions to meet the basic needs of children, to have food and to have a hygienic housing, and then medium term perhaps more changes to their behaviour in terms of impulsivity and so on. Also in terms of the parents and their parenting skills. Then in the long term we can have indicators such as success at school and their overall well-being. So that means that ideally, with our research, we want to be able to measure these different indicators in the short, medium and long term. Given that the CSPs are acting over the long term, it is possible to measure this insofar as the families are still coming to the CSP centres. Another source of complexities is that sometimes we've got intermediate and then final intervention targets. Melanie Berry talked about this idea this morning, the fact that we've got some that are more immediate targets and others that are more on a long-term basis. There's many social pediatric measures that are undertaken to work with the parents and work on their parenting skills. These are intermediate targets. It's not the ultimate target, which is, of course, the child. But ideally, in research, we want to be able to measure both the intermediate targets and the attaining of these intermediate targets, and then the attaining of the ultimate or final targets. And then we want to have customized, non-standardized interventions, and that can then make it rather complicated in terms of assessing the interventions. And then finally, the same indicator may be affected by several components of the intervention. And here I'm going to show you something on the screen. This is an example, in fact. Over the last few months, we've been working on a model, a theoretical model for change, a logic model which makes more explicit how the intervention actually produces these effects with the CSP interventions. We've worked hard on this, and I was happy to hear Melanie Berry talking about this morning. She was talking about a theoretical model of change. This is what it is. Before you measure things, you have to understand what we're doing. We need to describe our actions over the last few months. That's what we've been doing, been drawing on what we've learned about social pediatrics, and also based on literature that deals with risk factors and how to protect children. Also literature about different intervention models that are similar and that share some characteristics with social pediatrics. So now we've established this model, and that's just one small part of the model. It's just one example here to show that up at the top we've got the different processes, the different services that are offered. In this example, we're talking about disruptive types of behaviour. So which theory of change can we actually postulate here to explain the different effects of the social pediatric interventions on disruptive behaviours. When we're talking about disruptive types of behaviour, we're talking about forms of aggression, hyperactivity, and opposition types of disorders. So with what we've learned and the work that we've been able to do, we've concluded that there were probably at least two mechanisms that have been impacted by this social pediatric intervention, which then also have an impact on the disruptive types of behaviour. So at the top, we've got the processes, the services offered. Then in the middle, we're talking about the more specific intermediate mechanisms, and then we've got the intervention target at the bottom. So that shows you that here, in fact, we've just got one indicator, disruptive forms of behaviour, but we see there's at least 5 services that may have an impact on this. And if I'd broken this down into more detail, no doubt I could have come up with even more elements. That's just to show you how complex all of this actually is. So with this type of assessment, we're faced with various challenges. We can meet these challenges, but of course we need to draw on collaboration within the CSPCs. We need to make a collective effort on all of this. And now I'm going to talk to you about this research design model, which is used in research, but it's also used by practitioners. It's strongly recommended for practitioners in different areas. These are models that can be set up by the researchers, but they can also be implemented by practitioners to see the impact of their practices. Of course, this is something that we would like to possibly set up within the CSPCs, and if people are very much interested in this in the CSP centres, then the idea is that the researchers can guide the implementation of this type of research design. So briefly, I want to talk about this. It's better to just show you a picture rather than 1,000 words. So this is a hypothetical scenario that was used by the authors. You've got the references at the end, so you can look these up if you wish. It's not a real intervention that's been implemented, but it's one that could be implemented. This illustrates the effects of an intervention on social skills, which would be developed with young autistic children. And the effect is measured, the effect of the intervention is measured with 3 students in schools. And the way in which this works is as follows. We take these measurements at a given set interval. On the axis, we've got the days. On the horizontal axis, when the measures are taken, and then the vertical axis, we've got all the different social contacts that have been initiated over lunch by the children. So how does this design work? We've got 2 phases. First of all, we've got the basic phase. That's the baseline on the left of the vertical axis. The vertical line represents the beginning of the intervention. Everything to the right of this vertical line is post-intervention, after the intervention actually started. This then allows us, thanks to this type of research design, to see the changes between individuals. In the first phase, we set up the measures so that we've got a baseline which is relatively stable. What is the child's behaviour like in general in their normal state pre-intervention? And we need to have quite a stable baseline, because that's the basis for evaluating then the impact of the intervention. So we have about 5 time measurements, then we start the intervention, and then we continue to take measurements, and we plot them on this graph as you see up on the screen. Amongst the different types of behaviour, here, as I've said, we were talking about social skills and when children approach others, but it could be a whole different range of behaviours, for example, aggressive behaviour. It's very wide what we can actually measure, as long as it's quantifiable and as long as we can correctly define the measure. So if we're able to meet those two conditions, then we can set up this type of design. Obviously, when it comes to the analysis of itself, in research often we have quantitative analysis as well as the visual analysis, but in the clinical setting, we'll consider that the visual analysis may be considered as sufficient to show the impact of the intervention. There are certain authors who don't agree with that, but the majority of authors do say that in order to measure the effects of the intervention in a clinical setting, it can be appropriate to just stick to the visual analysis. As researchers, of course, we want to go further so that we can look at different controls and look at moderation effects and more complex matters. But in a clinical setting, this works well when we just go with the visual analysis approach. With the visual analysis, we look at the different changes to the slope and the median, and also the variability that can be relevant. You can see there's a change right away after the start of the intervention. There's a change in the slope, and if we had an average of the behaviours before and after, we would also see that there had been an impact. So these are designs that are very useful to be able to measure in an accurate way the impact of this type of intervention. So the previous example was an example to show the nitty-gritty of how this works, but now this is an example of a real analysis of a wraparound model which is set up, which is personalized and set up within the community. And so there's some similarities with the social pediatrics model. And in fact, this was with the adolescents, young people. They looked at the impact of the wraparound model on young people who are at risk of being taken into care, and they looked at the number of days per week where there were appropriate peer interactions, at least 85% of the time or greater. So they defined the behaviour that was to be observed. This is to show that this can be implemented for lots of complex intervention models, such as the one that we use in the community social pediatric centres. So why is this type of research design relevant for you? That was just to give you a quick overview. These are relevant because they're extremely flexible and they really concentrate on the individual and their specific response to the intervention. We look at the change per individual, so we can have a heterogeneity of the different profiles. We can have very different profiles, and that's very useful for social pediatrics because from what I've seen, there's lots of different profiles that present with the different children that are followed in the CSPCs, and we can also track these individualized interventions where there may be multiple components or not. In the wraparound model there's multiple components. There can be other sorts of more simple intervention that can be covered, and it's easy to apply this in a practical setting. You don't need many resources, you don't need to invest a great deal in order to establish this type of model. And you don't need to have many cases required. In the examples I showed you, there were several cases, but it's also possible to do it with one single case. But it's a specific type of model then, and with single cases designs, there's various sub-models which fall into this. You could have perhaps just 3 or 4 children and you'd still be able to measure the impact, and you can reduce it to a single case being covered. Another interesting aspect of this type of research design is that it can help you to validate different intervention practices in this perspective of having continuous improvement, because very quickly you've got access to these measures, and in the examples that I shared with you, there would nothing that prevent you. If you saw, for example, the intervention was not being very effective, then you could add another phase to the single case design. So you'd add in another phase and see how the behaviour would change when we change the intervention. So this morning, Melanie Berry was talking about the iterative approach, going backwards and forwards, back and forth over time. So that is the type of design that allows us to do this back and forth. And as is always the case with assessment models, there are certain limits. Repetitive measures may be demanding as much as possible. You have to try and respect the design that's been established in terms of the number of measures to be taken. But given the flexibility of the models, you can plan out this well to try and overcome this type of constraint. The answer to overcoming this is to plan ahead how we're going to work, have a correct definition of your measure, and know how we're going to collect these data. You can use a system which is not very cumbersome at all. I know that my colleague had a measurement system with their phone. So there's lots of different easy ways to deal with all of this without it being cumbersome when it comes to data collection. And then, of course, there's the partiality of the informers. There we're talking about the parents, those who intervene, the teachers, or it can be the child himself or herself if they're able to talk about all this. And all of these people may be rather biased in their assessments. Parents, well, there's the placebo effect that comes up. They will overestimate the impact of the intervention, and there's different ways of overcoming these biases and trying to limit these, for example, by using several sources of information. That does, of course, make it a bit more difficult to set this up, but it's worth it. It's worth the investment. And another limit is the deviation in the assessment of the target behaviour. This is generally noted when we have these repetitive measures. Generally, people start to change the way of assessing things. It happens with teachers when you have these measures that are repeated over time. This can be another problem. There may be some deviations that creep in, but there are solutions once again. For example, you can have this recall point, say, right, this is what we're trying to obtain from this assessment. These are solutions that all researchers are familiar with, and we can certainly guide you to implement this type of research design if you have shown interest in setting this up in the CSPC.